Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to wait a couple minutes while people join us. Okay, well, let's start. Mm. Welcome, everyone, to today's talk by Nanase Shirokawa, Imprinting Space on the Artist's Book. This presentation is part of the Book Arts Research Fellowship, which is a program that invites researchers and scholars from diverse fields to engage with CBA's distinctive artist books collection and submit research proposals that draw from its contents. The Book Arts Research Fellowship Program is made possible with the generous support from the Pine Tree Foundation of New York. A little housekeeping before we begin. Please keep your microphones muted. The talk will last about 45 minutes, and then afterwards we will have time for a Q&A. But if you have a question along the way, please put it in the chat, and I'll be happy to read it out loud when the talk is over. Um, the event is being recorded, so if you don't wish to appear in the recording, please turn off your cameras as well, and it will be available after the talk on our YouTube channel. Nanase Shirokawa is an art worker currently based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her research focuses on memorial making, public art, legacies of imperialism in the Pacific, visual and spatial representations of nuclear energy, and the production of architectural knowledge across print media. She has worked at cultural institutions, including the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts, and the Architectural League of New York. She holds a bachelor's degree in art history from Williams College and an MS in history, theory, and criticism of architecture and art from MIT, where her thesis on the memorial parks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the discourse of peacemaking in post-war Japan received the Arthur Roch Special Prize. Thank you, Nanase, and welcome.
Thank you, Camila, for the introduction. And thank you to the Center of Book Arts for this opportunity to delve into their collections over the past year. I'm going to share my screen. And thank you all for joining me here today. So this project grew out of an interest I had in interactions between architects, photographers, book designers, and other constituents who are involved in the process of architectural bookmaking. I had been looking in particular at this book, Katsura, Tradition and Creation in Japanese Architecture, which grew out of a collaboration between the photographer Ishimoto Yasuhiro and architect Tange Kenzo. Both were part of the many Japanese modernists who had developed a deep interest in early modern and pre-modern Japanese architecture. And after realizing that they had independently become fascinated with the 17th century imperial villa in Kyoto, they decided to collaborate on a photo book. Tange ended up taking the reins on the project, cropping and rearranging Ishimoto's images despite the photographer's protestations, in order to put forth an ideological treatise on the counterbalanced forces of tradition and modernity in Japanese architecture. The croppings are not terribly dramatic, but when seen side by side, we can notice the ways in which they shift where the eye is directed and where the center of gravity falls in the image. What interested me about the book were two things. First, that the medium of the book served as the platform where these creative differences were surfaced and made palpable. And second, that Tange opens the book with this claim that these fragmentary details will not convey the image of the architectural whole, nor do they aspire to. He continues to write that the building itself, even in person, cannot be consumed as a unitary object, as it embodies the very collision of tradition and anti-tradition that he believes undergirds the language of modernism in Japan. Architecture and bookmaking have long been kindred spirits, but this prompted me to wonder, how might we understand the book as an interface where the limits and possibilities of spatial representation are questioned and explored? And how does the translation of three-dimensional space into two-dimensional images, and in turn, a three-dimensional book, shift the ways in which we understand the spaces we inhabit and encounter? The turn towards the book as a place for interfacing with the built environment is also, I think, an act that is intimately intertwined with memorializing and archiving space. The act of recording and compiling fundamentally shapes the character and contents of memory, as does the translation of built environments into handheld, portable, and reproducible formats. Most of the 6 works I'm going to discuss today deal with architectural and environmental loss through disaster, displacement, demolition, or decay. Some of them are directly responsive to the conventions of architectural representation and subvert them, while others are more fluid in their interpretation, using the format of the book itself to question the relationships between bodies and the built environment. I think of all of these books as sites of memory, not merely as places where spatial narratives are held and interpreted, but also as places where, as historian Pierre Nora writes, moments of history are torn away from the movement of history, then returned, no longer quite life, not yet death, like shells on the shore when the sea of living memory has receded. And so all these books that I'm going to discuss today sort of negotiate this intermediary space and offer an intermediary space to interface between buildings, environments, and people. And so I want to begin with this work that I encountered at CVA, one that captures the traumas of displacement through the kind of haunting pull that spaces have on memory. Through recalling homes that can no longer be accessed and subverting the formal instruments of bureaucracy, the incomplete Thambu is a document of survival that pushes for the perseverance of the subjective against the amnesia of the state. The book takes the form of a Thambu, a Portuguese/Dutch term coined during the occupation of Sri Lanka by these successive empires. The term refers to a public land registry, and as the artist Themotharampillai Shanathanan mentions on the cover page, it's not known to be used in any other country outside of Sri Lanka. The artist carried out this project between January and July 2011, just 2 years after the end of the Sri Lankan War, which had lasted for nearly 30 years. On the cover, Shanathanan explicitly lays out the premise and terms of the book. He writes, "All drawings related to built structures are not drawn to scale and are subject to interpretation. All characters appearing in this work are based on real persons. Any resemblance to fictitious events is purely coincidental." These two statements are reversals of the standard disclaimers that we see in architectural drawings and works of fiction, that drawings are done to scale and are intended to be read objectively in the same way for any viewer, and that in the case of the latter, for a fictional work, any resemblance to real people as being purely coincidental. Each of the 80 documents is comprised of three elements: ground plans of homes drawn from memory by a Tamil civilian displaced from the city of Jaffna, a transcription of the subject's memories of the home, followed by dry pastel drawings made by the artist in response to these recollections. The personal accounts of these refugees are numbered and standardized in format, taking on the trappings of a bureaucratic dossier. Yet the individual contents of each entry, in contrast, are deeply personal, striking, and distinct in voice. They're also fragmentary in a way that disrupts the attempt of a thombu to create order and evoke the illusion of coherence and comprehensiveness. The project as a whole grounds itself in these kinds of subtle inversions and provocations, taking the drab language and the banal violence of administrative power and making subversive changes that destabilize the ways in which we approach these spatial reconstructions. Some drawings focus on individual rooms in the house, while others also depict the surrounding yards and property, cross streets and nearby buildings and rivers. Each drawing is also overlaid with a sheet of tracing paper, where the artist has drawn, in a more conventional architectural fashion, an annotated version of the contributor's home, with identifiers labeled and translated in English. The plan drawing on tracing paper functions as a sort of neutralizing force, taking all the individualized drawings and standardizing them under a common visual treatment. But the quality of the paper and the effect of the overlay also act as ghostly reminders of these sites that no longer exist as they once did in the minds of these contributors. They also make these sites legible to the reader by identifying rooms and features, while acting as a semi-permeable boundary that separates the reader from the lived experience of the interviewee. Some texts are spare, while others go into great detail about the kinds of furniture, plants, experiences, and objects tied to these places. Others recall the specific moments of displacement and loss. Some are printed on pieces of scrap paper where the drawing on the reverse can be seen bleeding through the page. This one here is printed on the reverse of a tax withholding notice, blurring the boundaries between the personal and the administrative dimensions of life. The dry pastel drawings by the artists that follow offer dreamlike, haunting scenes of disembodied forms, departing trucks, empty furniture, dinner tables with no guests, and aircrafts gliding across disassembled houses. These indeterminate scenes capture the hazy and slippery quality of memories, especially memories as they're recounted to others, and the pains that accompany the act of recalling memories of violence and loss. I often turn to the work of the historian Svetlana Boym in order to think about the politics and pain of remembering and reconstructing the past. Boym, writing on the elusive force of nostalgia as a contemporary historical emotion, describes nostalgia as being not merely an artistic device, but a strategy of survival, a way of making sense of the impossibility of homecoming. This longing for home and its associated sensations and material residues, coupled with the irreconcilable lack of belonging in an unfamiliar place, sustains the continued disjunction between the actual places these people inhabited and the fragile fragments they're able to offer us in the scheme of the book. These stories, which resist the dominant narratives of the state, instead emerge at the fissures and gaps of conventional records and archives. The book, in both form and content, is a place to reckon with the violence of displacement and the irresolvable grief that accompanies uprootedness. It meditates between the impossibility of both returning home and making a new home after exile. In doing so, it offers a space where images and texts can together capture the sensitivity of human presence, while leaving room to contemplate the inevitable absences of memory. The form of the architectural plan and its interplay with text is also explored in Sarah Halsey's The Space of Poetics, a meditation of sorts on Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space. Halsey's book similarly makes use of plan drawings and transparencies, but in this case, appropriates these models to consider the book as a place to explore the relationship between space and language. Like the incomplete Dambu, Halsey's book has a rhythmic sequence to it. A brief passage from the Poetics of Space is printed on the left-hand page, with each word numbered. The opposite page features an abstracted, white on blue woodcut of geometric forms that seem to suggest the contours of city blocks, or perhaps a network of electrical circuits. In between them is a translucent mylar sheet, where a series of linear paths are projected upon the plan. Various nodes are numbered with digits that correspond to those under the words. While the plan stays consistent throughout the book, the linear patterns change in every iteration in tandem with the prose. The diagram is inspired by the 1916 edition of the Sanborn Insurance Maps of Philadelphia, a document not unlike the Bamboo in that it is a collection of records that tracks property ownership, in this case, for the purposes of assessing liabilities for fire insurance companies. While the relationship between words, numbers, and linear patterns is never made explicit, reading and navigating at the same time attunes us to the pauses between words and the cadence of the prose. We might see them as analogous to the stretches of space and the sharp turns that snake across the plan as words sputter out at synapses. Bachelard's 1958 book argues that the spaces that we inhabit, particularly the intimate domestic nooks and crannies that we find shelter and comfort in, are integral in shaping our thoughts, dreams, and memories. And he embraces a phenomenological orientation towards the construction of the built environment. The 101-word single sentence featured in this book focuses on spaces of solitude and the importance of seclusion in fostering creative thought. Halsey, who has a background in linguistics, is attuned to the structural qualities of language and uses these to draw a relationship between syntax and space. The ways in which we string together phrases, however intuitive, are governed by a set of rules and categorical types that find resonance in the diagrammatic standardized quality of these imagined blueprints. We construct sentences from within an existing structure, just as one might chart out a network of pathways on a circuit board. In going back and forth between text, numbers, and diagrams, we also become attuned to the paths that our thoughts take as we read words on a page. These paths meander, turn back on themselves, change course abruptly, or linger in corners and alcoves. The final words of the excerpt read, "Even when we no longer have a garret, when the attic room is lost and gone, there remains the fact that we once loved a garret, once lived in an attic." These spaces that we once inhabited but no longer exist still continue to persist, Bachelard insists, within the depths of memory. What Halsey's book so quietly and poignantly illuminates in these ghostly translucent layers are the ways in which our thoughts take shape in response to the physical contours of the spaces that we inhabit, disappearing and reappearing as we continually revisit them, whether physically or in dreams. If we take these first two books as projects that appropriated the conventions of architectural representation to offer more intimate understandings of our relationships to inhabited space, this next one transforms the narrative conventions of architectural history, turning an investigation of a single building into a constellation of questions and ideas surrounding grief, institutional harms, and the failures of utopic thinking, using the book as a scaffolding for these thoughts. How might a book become a place to mourn and eulogize the building? Discipline Park emerges from poet Toby Altman's fixation with a single building, Prentice Women's Hospital in Chicago, a concrete brutalist structure with a distinctive quatrefoil plan that sat atop a glass box. Prentice, where the author was born, was part of Northwestern University, where Altman also happened to be teaching when he began writing this book. The architect of the hospital, Bertrand Goldberg, is known for housing and institutional projects, many of which have these sorts of organic, tubular, and curvilinear forms to them. His best-known project is the Marina City apartment complex, which still stands in Chicago. Goldberg's dense, often mixed-use projects emerged out of a desire to resist the force of suburban flight and use architecture as a mode of fostering community ties. At Prentice, the administrative, research, and clinical functions of the hospital were housed in the rectangular volume at the base, while the maternity care facilities were located in the upper portion. Each leaf of the clover had a set of radiating maternity rooms, with a nursing station placed in each center, creating little pods that stood as a contrast to the prototypical extended hallway forms we often find in hospitals. Despite years of protestations by preservationists, the university eventually demolished the building in 2013 in order to make way for a new medical research facility. Altman's book grows out of this demolition, fusing together autobiography, architectural, and urban history to produce a critical reflection on the relationships between body and institution, the hostility and intimacy of brutalist architecture and its conceits, and the utopic dreams and systematic failures latent in the built environment. Blocks of text float across the pages, some nearly invisible against the gray ground of the paper. Screenshots from a YouTube time-lapse video of the demolition show the slow death of the building as the pages unfold. The shots begin with the structure clad in scaffolding in daylight, and as we progress, we gradually see the clover-shaped upper volume shrink. The building is then swallowed by smog and darkness as night falls, and when morning comes, only the rectangular base remains. It gradually erodes away, leaving only an empty lot, compressing the process into an imagined 24-hour interval. Throughout this, Altman refers back to his own experience of a slow death or demolition within the very same institution, as he wryly remarks here on the circularity of capital within Northwestern. I receive an email from the institution, he writes, asking for its money. In the second section of the book, the images start to disintegrate, as if glitching or melting into the ground of the page, concrete giving way to paper. Altman weaves in diaristic musings about the weight of the institution on his shoulders, PR quotes from Northwestern officials defending the demolition, and poetic interludes that carry with them a sense of exhaustion, as if to identify with the weariness of the building itself. He works in layers, taking meandering paths as if navigating the convoluted networks of bureaucracy and its institutional spaces and constraints. The third section, titled The Institution and Its Moods, is Altman's own architectural survey of Goldberg's still standing projects throughout the US. He takes field notes on the buildings and their surroundings, with particular attention given to the disjunctures between how they appear to him and how they are described in the texts he reads about them. The Drexel Home and Gardens, here on the left, have been remodeled to such a degree that Altman admits, "I'm not sure even now that I went to the right place." These houses were part of a joint venture with a private developer to create an affordable, efficiently constructed, and importantly, integrated housing community in the south side of Chicago during the 1950s. "That's sweet, isn't it?" Altman interjects. The complex never fully came to fruition, as white families intending to purchase the homes were refused mortgages by banks who, in Goldberg's words, said that any white family who felt they could live next door to Blacks was either crazy or liberal, and in either case, they weren't a good mortgage risk. Altman sympathizes with the plight of Goldberg's failed idealistic vision to create a more democratic and community-oriented way of living through architecture, calling the demolition of Prentice an allegory of neoliberalism. At the same time, he also reckons with the absurdity of obsessing over a building, one that he even admits he only properly looked at after it was demolished. At its heart, Altman admits, this is not a book about political economy or institutional critique. No, this is a book about love. He goes on further to admit that it feels bad to love these buildings, to feel sentimental about their humanistic aspirations, given the societal failures that they embody. Altman pieces together an alternative architectural history, one that constructs itself from the rubble of the archive and the bits and pieces of the personal, a eulogy of destruction that uses the form of the book to reveal the slipperiness of these seemingly impermeable concrete behemoths. Dismantling and reconstructing the materials and values of the building, using words and images on the page, the book acts as a malleable interface for grappling with the past. Part of what the form of the artist book also does with regards to Discipline Park and the next few works I'll discuss is that it operates as a mediator between the individual body and the insurmountable scale of the built environment. It's a place where these sprawling institutions and landscapes can become atomized and laid bare. In turn, these books expose us to our own vulnerabilities by making visible the hopes, desires, and even love that we invest in these structures that will never be reciprocated, pushing us to embrace failure as a function of remembering. While the three books I've shared earlier focus on the loss of individual buildings or homes, this one takes as its subject Trips Run, a stream in Northern Virginia. Channel and Flow by Sarah McDermott visually follows the path of a stream as it courses through a suburban neighborhood, specifically over the course of 2 miles as the artist encountered it, quote, both as flow and as fragment. Much of the stream has been channelized or piped underground over the past several decades as the area experienced accelerated development during the 1960s and 70s. McDermott remarks that it's even up for debate whether Trips Run can be considered a stream at all. Yet the book maintains that whether by environmental definition or not, Trips Run does exist in some form or another. A presence we experience like an echo, McDermott writes, appearing and disappearing, perhaps most reliably visible as the negative space inside an environment that has been built under, over, and up to its edges. In this regard, the book is a fitting format for capturing presence and absence simultaneously, and actively forcing us to reckon with limits, boundaries, and edges through the mere act of reading. The stream is the continuous, amorphous strip that runs across the bottom half of each page, shifting in color from a verdant green to khaki to at times this sickly yellow. Changes in textures of the surroundings suggest man-made interventions like paved paths and concrete walls. At various points of rupture, which are delineated by the borders of the page, we see the areas where the stream disappears underground, invisible, but nevertheless still present as it flows beneath a brick wall or a backyard. The format of a book necessarily conditions us to seek out a continuous sequential narrative, in this case with the stream as the constant. But pagination forces us to consume in discrete segments. The act of flipping or unfolding pages imbues the reader with the feeling of rupture that McDermott felt as she encountered walls or property abutments or saw the stream shrink or disappear under paved surfaces. Some pages fold out, suggestive of the meandering paths and turns one might take on a walk. These gnarled branches reappear across the book, sometimes in large clusters and other times in little whispers. In this particular spread, we see them sprawl across the stream, entangled with what could be wires or tubes. These recurring growths have the same persistence as the stream itself, as forces that interact with and push back against the built environment and human presence. There's this term in urban ecology, ruderal communities, that refers to the spontaneous, stubborn, organic life that emerges from cracks in the pavement, alongside train tracks, or on industrial sites, places where we don't expect to see green. These sorts of spillages and outcroppings that recur throughout the book question the boundaries between organic and inorganic, reminding us about how resistant unexpected nature's will can be. Within the physical context of the book, these confrontations with boundary conditions become all the more apparent when we see how they appear in relation to the surface and edges of the page as a platform. The book helps convey the phenomenological experience of encountering the stream, but in projecting the stream onto the pages of the book, we also become attuned to the reverse effect. That is, the ways in which our attempts to understand the spaces and environments around us also reveal the limits of our comprehension. The artist describes her practice as one of observing and interpreting the ways that people attempt to create order, with varying degrees of permanence, by manipulating and defining space within the built environment. In this fragmentary journey, the book makes visible the adjacency and the suffusion between environmental control and nature's fickle trajectories. In a sense, the act of making the book itself is an attempt to create order while consciously reckoning with the inherent limitations of those attempts, the incommensurability of natural forces, and the peculiarities that arise at these human nature boundaries, which are far more porous than we often think. In a similar vein of tracking environmental change, control, and disappearance, Patty Ching's The Wandering Lake uses the book to fuse together travelogue and autobiography through images and texts that incorporate historical narratives, political conditions, and personal reflections. This book was part of a 2017 exhibition at the Queen's Museum, but I do think it's one of those exhibition catalogs that isn't part of record of the exhibition, but also exists on its own terms. The work takes its title from a 1938 book by the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin. Hedin spent years in pursuit of Lop a lake that was part of the Tarim River Basin in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. The lake had been a source of intrigue for many explorers, as it had been described in ancient histories as an expansive body of water, but human interventions in the surrounding areas had caused it to dry up and become difficult to locate. Hedin put forth a theory that the river feeding into the lake periodically changed course, causing the lake to wander, disappearing and reappearing in different locations over time. Chang embarks on a similar journey, tracking down these expansive, elusive bodies of water like Lop Nor, and as well as the ever-shrinking Aral Sea, which, due to the massive irrigation projects implemented by the Soviet Union, is now a fraction of the size it once was at the turn of the 20th century. She also traces the path of the south to north water diversion project in China, a sort of incomprehensibly large, forever growing infrastructural project that brings water from the Yangtze River to the arid north across the span of 2,700 miles. These travels are intertwined with her own pregnancy journey, as she intersperses passages from What to Expect When You're Expecting, recounts all the food she consumes and the nausea that follows, alongside excerpts like this one, a text from a human rights research report on the forced sterilization of women in Uzbekistan. Across the pages of the book, we see residues of Soviet-era infrastructure and the ways in which it creeps into the water. She recounts the saltiness of the black tea she is served, a function of the groundwater becoming increasingly salinated as the Aral Sea continues to dry up. Like Altman does in Discipline Park, Chang uses the page to move across registers, using differentiators like insets and italicized texts to shift between historical commentary and more abstract ruminations on loss and longing. Throughout, she draws connections between the flow of her own bodily fluids and that of the bodies of water she follows, reflecting on the ways in which, at both individual and infrastructural scale, these liquids flit between controlled and uncontrolled flow. During long car journeys, Chang used feminine urinary devices with plastic bottles that she began to save and sync with the infrastructural checkpoints along the paths of these massive water diversion projects. She later makes these glass-blown urinary devices inspired by these makeshift contraptions, which is what you see here to the left. In trying to time her bodily functions and use them as a method of documenting changes in the landscape, she melds together the body and landscape as constituents of the same liquid world, filling and emptying themselves as they sustain and struggle against their environmental conditions. She also revisits Uzbekistan after her son is born, dispelling her pumped breast milk into various empty food receptacles to evoke a parallel with the shrinking Aral Sea, a sympathetic loss of flow, as she puts it. The Uzbek government prohibited her from filming the sites she visited, making her photographs of the discarded milk both acts of resistance and alternative records of a journey that eluded filmic documentation. In both The Wandering Lake and Channel and Flow, we see the book operate as a mediator in between the scale of the body and the scale of infrastructure. The book becomes a channel for these movements back and forth across scales, and the construction of the layout and narrative in a book allows artists to create adjacencies that might otherwise not be feasible in other media. In Chang's narrative, the book becomes a place where the inextricable ties between body and land become most apparent, where caregiving and geopolitics, Individual liberties and environmental degradation come together in these analogs that rely on one another in order to propel the journey forward. To close this talk and to really lean into thinking about the spatial material presence of the book itself as an object and carrier of memory, I'm turning now to this work, which Jillian at the Center of Book Arts had kindly introduced me to after it was featured in an exhibit there. This work, titled Absence, was architect J. Mi-jin Yoon's submission for the World Trade Center Memorial Competition in 2003, a sort of anti-monument, a tangible, human-scaled memorial that called for a more pensive, contemplative reflection on loss. It's a relatively compact and dense book that begins with several pages that have a single pinhole dot. This initial uncertainty about the book's subject after the first few pages, begins to give way to clarity when the pages turn into two squares. These holes signify the antenna tower that rose from the North Tower, and the squares the outline of the towers themselves. Each of the 110 cardstock pages corresponds to a floor of each of the twin towers. These squares continue through the rest of the book until you reach the final page, a larger view of the streets surrounding the two structures, represented by stenciled apertures that correspond to the outlines of the nearby buildings. By hollowing out the space of the buildings within the frame of the book, the medium effectively allows you to read the structures from sky to street, making their absence present through this tactile floor-by-floor encounter. The pagination also causes the reader to implicitly participate in the deconstruction of the buildings. The buildings are whole only when the book is closed and undisturbed. In engaging with the memorial traces of the tragedy, we are only able to access fragments, piecing together floor by floor, bit by bit. It's a quietly striking proposition, and I think the act of rendering the memorial within the format of the book testifies, in part, to the paradox of memorializing a tragedy in a single site. There's a certain impossibility to consolidating a memorial act to the site of the building, when in actuality, tragedy unfolds across rippling amorphous paths that cannot be isolated in a bounded place or a specific moment in time. All of the pages are white, and there are no illustrations or texts, as if to attest to the unspeakability of trauma and the impossibility of putting into words the expansive and incommensurable nature of tragedy. The book presents the memorial as a personal and portable entity, and is also clever in its construction of absence through negative space. Just as the winning proposal prompts us to look to the subterranean, so the book pushes us to see beyond the site, carving out loss from solid space. What this book so lucidly and simply evokes too are the ways in which both architecture and books grapple with the tension of being an assemblage of many visible and invisible parts, while also presenting themselves as unitary objects. Both, in their own ways, I think, struggle with the duality that we speak of them as singular objects of contemplation, despite the fact that they are never understood or experienced as a whole in their entirety. We encounter architecture as singular bodies navigating spaces of shifting elevations, textures, pathways, and sightlines. Similarly, we encounter the book page by page, a series of discrete obverses and reverses that require us to activate sight and touch and become attuned to the rhythms by which we digest passages and images. The deconstruction and reconstruction of built space into book space forces us to reckon with the collapsibility of the world and the ease at which the seemingly stable can be dismantled and reconstructed. In doing so, we might be freed to reconfigure our relationships to places and their associated histories, and imagine alternative forms of memorialization that resist the model of the fixed, immutable monument. As sites of memory, the artist books that I've explored today are all fields of encounter where both artists and us readers are compelled to think about the ways in which memories coalesce in places both real and imagined, and further, the ways in which memory is an elusive, constantly mutating force. Its fluid and fickle nature is in part the reason for our persistent desire to affix it in time and space. Though the act of imprinting space within the domain of a book is certainly an attempt to affix those memories, the artist's book also offers space to explore representational strategies that center subjectivity in ways that are not accorded by traditional modes of architectural drawing. As we create and consume these narratives, layouts, and material constructions, the books act back upon us, pushing us to question the ostensible solidity of the structures and boundaries that govern us, and attuning us to the marginal, residual, and spectral elements of the world around us, the very places where memories arise and begin to take shape. Thank you.